When you think of a murderous cannibal, who comes to mind? The Wisconsin cannibal, the Milwaukee monster, Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer was an American serial killer and sex offender during the late 70s and through to the early 90s. He drugged, strangled, raped, dismembered, and committed atrocious acts of necrophilia and cannibalism on at least 17 men. Before we delve into the murderous life that Dahmer created for himself, let's start from a place and time when he was truly innocent. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960. His parents were Lionel Herbert Dahmer, an analytical chemist, and his mother, Joyce Annette Dahmer. They both described him as a typical boisterous and loud little boy. That is, until the age of 4, when he went into surgery to correct a double hernia. After the surgery, they state he was different. Something had changed. He was now noticeably subdued, and over the next 10 years, he became increasingly withdrawn and uncommunicative. When he was 7 years old, his brother David was born. This worsened Jeffrey's attitude. When Jeffrey was 8 years old, the family moved to Bath, Ohio. Here he showed very little interest in hobbies or social events. He preferred to ride his bike around his neighbourhood, looking for the carcasses of dead animals. He enjoyed dissecting the bodies in the woods or taking them back to his house to examine them. One disturbing time, he placed a dog's head on a spike. Here, we have the makings of a total psychopath. Lack of empathy, lack of guilt or remorse, dishonesty, animal torture. This is the recipe for a serial killer. Please do keep in mind that not everyone who experiences life this way will grow up to be a murderer. Dahmer was a fringe case. There is usually something deeper and more traumatic that occurs to trigger the murderous impulses into reality. Jeffrey attended Revere High School and was largely a loner who did poorly in his lessons. He did become popular for one thing. He would mock his mother's interior decorator, who had cerebral palsy. While in high school, he began to drink heavily. He was disengaged from the life around him. He was tense and for the most part, friendless. Looking back after his crimes, he said that the murder and necrophilia urges began around the age of 14, though he wouldn't act on them for a few more years. This was also the time that his parents' marriage was dissolving. They were going through a bitter divorce. That divorce was finalised in 1977. By 1978, Jeffrey had graduated high school by the skin of his teeth. 3 weeks later, at only 18 years of age, he would go on to take his first victim, Stephen Hicks. Dahmer's father was out of the house on a business trip, and his mother had recently moved away and taking his brother David with her, so Jeffrey was alone. Hicks was a hitchhiker that Dahmer came across and told him that they could go to his father's house to get drunk and have sex. Dahmer was able to get the man drunk quickly, but Hicks soon wanted to leave. When he tried to leave, he was bludgeoned over the head with a 10-pound dumbbell. Then, he was strangled to death. Dahmer then took his time to dissect, dissolve, pulverize, and bury the body in the backyard in small plastic bags. He later exhumed the body, crushed it up further, and scattered it in the woods. Dahmer later admitted that he killed Hicks because he wanted him to stay. He didn't want to be alone. That fall, Dahmer started attending university classes at Ohio State University. He only lasted one semester before dropping out due to his alcoholism. He regularly missed class, and when he did show up, he would be drunk and barely able to function. After dropping out, his father insisted that he enlist in the military and do something else with his life. He officially enlisted in December of 1978. He was soon posted to Germany as a combat medic. He did well at first, with a strict routine and regulation of the military. But soon his alcoholism became a problem once again. He was discharged in 1981 because of his uncontrollable drinking. He was told that he could have a plane ticket to anywhere in the United States. He chose Florida. He said that he felt tired and cold. He stayed in Florida for a relatively short time. He spent most of it in the hospital. It is unclear why, perhaps related to his drinking. Later that year, he returned to Ohio to face his disappointed father. His drinking continued and he was arrested for disorderly conduct in 1981. After this, he was sent to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. He lived with her for 6 years. She said that the time Jeffrey spent in her house was odd. She once found a fully dressed male mannequin in his closet. He said that he had stolen it from a local store. She also found a .357 Magnum under his bed. She said that he was prone to stay out all night and abuse alcohol. She would continually complain to Jeffrey and his father about the smell coming from the basement. He told them that he had brought home a dead squirrel and dissolved its body in acid. That's what, he said, was creating the repugnant smell. He was arrested again, this time for indecent exposure. He became a regular at gay bathhouses in the area. He was accused of drugging and raping men while they were unconscious, but he was never officially charged with rape, only indecent exposure. He was banned from the bathhouses. The indecent exposure escalated in 1985 when Dahmer was accused by 2 young boys of masturbating in front of them. He was only given a 1-year probationary sentence. After completing this probation, his grandmother asked him to leave her home. She was no longer comfortable with his late nights, strange behaviour, and the foul smells coming from the basement. He quickly found an apartment on Milwaukee's west side, close to his job at the Ambrosia chocolate factory. What I'm about to tell you next is extremely graphic and disturbing, so please proceed with caution. There were 9 years between Dahmer's first and second victim. September 15th, 1987, he may not have intended to kill his victim. In fact, when he met the 26-year-old Stephen Twomey, they had agreed to go to Dahmer's hotel room and have a drink. Dahmer claimed that he drank into blackout drunkenness, and when he woke up the next morning, Twomey was dead beside him. To dispose of his body, he brought in a large suitcase and carried him out. He took the body back into his grandma's basement. Here, he proceeded to masturbate over the corpse, then dismember it. He threw the remains into the forest. The following year, in 1988, Dahmer murdered 2 men. The first, James Jamie Doxteter, a 14-year-old boy that Dahmer offered money to take nude photos. He took the boy back to his grandmother's basement. They had sex, then he drugged and strangled the boy. He used acid and his own brute strength to destroy the body. 2 months later, he lured his second victim, 25-year-old Richard Guerrero, with the same excuse of cash for nude photos to his grandmother's house. They had sex, he then drugged and strangled him. He disposed of the body in a similar manner to the previous victim. There was an incident on the 25th of November 1988 that got Jeffrey into some hot water. He was charged with sexual exploitation and second-degree sexual assault for enticing a child for immoral purposes. Dahmer had offered a 13-year-old Laotian boy $50 to pose nude. He gave the boy drugged coffee and fondled him while he was unconscious. Unbeknownst to Dahmer, the boy wasn't fully unconscious, and he managed to escape at his first opportunity. He was convicted for this crime in January 1989. It is here that the timeline becomes somewhat fuzzy. After he was convicted of the charges I just mentioned, he was given a 5-year probation 1 year at a works release camp. He could go to work during the day and return to prison at night. He was monitored closely, and he was required to register as a sex offender. It was during this time, in March 1989, that he murdered Anthony Sears. He lured the man to his grandmother's basement, where he drugged, strangled, sodomized, photographed, dismembered, and disposed of the body. He kept Sears' skull as a souvenir. How was he able to kill this man if he was under strict supervision from the prison? This is a question that has not been answered. While Dahmer was incarcerated, his father wrote a letter to the judge who had presided over his son's trial. He requested psychological help for his son. Before the letter could be seriously considered, Dahmer was released. He only served 10 months and moved back in with his grandmother. Between this time and when he moved into his own apartment in 1990, it appears that he did not kill anyone else that we know of. The apartment that he moved into would become synonymous with his atrocious crimes. He moved in May 1990 and quickly lost what little control he had left. There would be 13 victims over the next year. Ricky Beaks, 33 years old. Dahmer met him at a club and offered him money to pose nude. He was drugged and strangled. Dahmer had sex with the body afterwards. Beaks' painted skull was later found during the search of the apartment. Edward Eddie Smith, 28 years old. They met at a local bar. Dahmer offered him money to pose nude. After Eddie was dead, Dahmer took great pleasure in photographing every step of the dismemberment. Ernest Miller, 24 years old. They met at a bookstore. Dahmer offered him money for sex. This is the only victim that he did not strangle. Instead, he cut the man's throat after sex. He took pictures during the dismemberment. He placed the biceps in the freezer, bleached the skull, and painted it. It was recovered after the arrest. It was this victim that he seriously began experimenting with cannibalism. David Thomas. Dahmer ran across him while walking down the street and offered him money for sex. Once back at the apartment, Dahmer didn't wait to have sex first. He immediately killed Thomas and took pictures during the dismemberment. By the summer of 1991, he was killing at least one person per week. Curtis Straughter, 18 years old. Dahmer picked him up while he was waiting at a bus stop. He offered him money for sex and brought him back to his apartment. He drugged, strangled, and had sex with the body. He dismembered it and kept the skull, which was found after the arrest, unpainted. Errol Lindsay, 19 years old. They met on the street and Dahmer offered him money for sex. He was drugged, strangled, and he had sex with the body. The unpainted skull was found after the arrest. The next victim that Dahmer picked up very narrowly missed his chance at freedom. It was the younger brother of the boy he had molested in 1988. Two women called into the police in hysterics, reporting that a young boy was walking around the neighbourhood naked, incoherent, obviously out of his mind on drugs, and bleeding from his rectum. Before the police arrived on the scene, Dahmer arrived and attempted to take the boy back up to his apartment, but the two ladies wouldn't let him. The officers that responded were John Balkozak and Joseph Gabrish. Dahmer calmly explained that the boy was his 19-year-old lover. He told the officers that they had been drinking, had a lover's quarrel, and he had stormed out of the apartment. The women knew that this story was a complete farce and tried to tell the police so. They told them that they knew the boy from the neighbourhood and that he was in fact no older than 14 years old. They attempted to explain that the boy could not speak English. Their concerns were brushed off by the police. They escorted the men back to Dahmer's apartment and briefly poked their heads in to have a look. They said there was a strange smell, but they did not investigate any further. If they had investigated, they would have found the dead, decomposing body of one of the latest victims in the bedroom. The police didn't want any further involvement in the homosexual domestic disturbance, so they left them alone. Dahmer killed him almost immediately, but not before attempting a crude lobotomy on the boy. He was almost caught in the act, but he would not be deterred. He kept on murdering. Tony Hughes, 31 years old. They had known each other for at least 2 years. Tony was deaf and mute, and they communicated through letters and notes. Dahmer offered him money to come and pose nude. He was drugged and murdered. There was no sex. His body was dismembered, and the unpainted skull was later found during the arrest. Matt Turner, 20 years old. Dahmer met the boy at a bus station after a gay pride parade in Chicago. He offered him money to pose, then drugged and strangled him with a strap. Turner's head was placed in the freezer, and other pieces of the body were placed in a large blue barrel of acid. This would become his signature disposal method. He would meticulously dismember his victims, photographing every step of the way, even posing some of the bodies. He would then save bits and pieces of them and destroy what was left in the vat of acid. Where he got the large blue drum of acid is unclear. The sludge that was left over, he would fish out and flush down the toilet. He began to see himself as a kind of mad scientist. He wanted to create the perfect zombie submissive sex slave. To do this, he experimented by drilling holes into the heads of his victims, usually while they were still alive, and pouring in boiling water or hydrophilic acid. He was aiming for the frontal lobe area of the brain, thinking that if he killed off the section of the brain, he would have the perfect specimen. So, the killings continued. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23 years old. They met at a Chicago gay bar. Dahmer offered him money for sex and said they could go back to his apartment in Milwaukee. Dahmer treated this man differently. He let the man live for at least one full day at his apartment before drugging and strangling him. He disposed of him in his regular manner. In July 1991, Dahmer was fired from his job at the chocolate factory because of his poor attendance. That same day, he picked up his next victim. Oliver Lacey, 23 years old, he agreed to go back to Dahmer's apartment for full body rubs. He was immediately drugged and strangled. His head was put in the fridge and his heart in the freezer so that Dahmer could eat it later. Joseph Bradshaft, 25 years old. Dahmer picked him up at the bus station and offered him money for nude photos. They had consensual sex before Dahmer went about drugging and strangling him with a strap. He placed this man's head in the fridge and dumped his body in the acid barrel. Finally, we come to his last attempted victim, Tracy Edwards, 32 years old. Dahmer lured him to his apartment with promises of cash for sex. He was forced into the bedroom at knife point, but there was a struggle. Dahmer was able to get at least one handcuff on Edwards before he was punched in the face, kicked in the stomach, and Edwards ran out the door. Edwards was able to flag down a passing police car and told him about this weird dude that had restrained him. He led them back to Dahmer's apartment. Dahmer was calm while talking to the police and attempted to tell them that they had just had a lover's quarrel. He had the keys to the handcuffs and he would gladly hand them over. Edwards remembered the knife that Dahmer had used to push him into the bedroom that smelled so horrible and had those graphic pictures on the walls. The police came into the apartment and investigated the bedroom. The officers found the photographs in the bedroom and promptly arrested Dahmer. One officer made the grave mistake of looking in the fridge. In the fridge, he found a human head. More thorough investigations were done in the apartment. They found some haunting things. The head in the refrigerator, 3 more in the freezer, severed hands and genitalia, preserved skulls, at least 7 were found, some painted, some unpainted, a human heart, and finally, they found an altar in his closet, where all of the skulls were set up in a bizarre fashion with candles, not to mention his extensive collection of macabre photography. Jeffrey Dahmer was charged with 17 counts of murder. It was later reduced to 15, and he was not charged with the attempted murder of Tracy Edwards. His trial began on January 30th, 1992. He pled not guilty by reason of insanity. He said he did these things because of an uncontrollable impulse. His defense team wanted to show that he had committed these crimes, but he had not known the severity of his actions. They told every gruesome detail of his behaviour as proof that only an insane man would have done these awful things. At the trial, strict security measures were enforced. An 8-foot-tall barrier of bulletproof glass was put up to separate Dahmer from the gallery in the courtroom. Extra guards were placed on the premises as well. Ultimately, the jury believed the prosecution. Dahmer was found guilty and sane on February 15, 1992. It took the jury 10 hours of deliberation to come to this conclusion. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms in prison, which was a total of 957 years. Wisconsin does not have the death penalty, so he would spend the rest of his natural life in prison. A 16th murder conviction was brought down upon him for the murder of Stephen Hicks. While in prison, he claimed to become a reformed man. He served his time at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Initially, he was kept segregated from the general population. He did express remorse for his actions and talked frequently about wanting to die. Eventually, he convinced prison officials to let him mingle with other inmates. He began to better himself. He found religion with some help from his father. His father stayed in regular contact and sent him letters, books, and photos. Jeffrey said he was a born-again Christian and he was ready for his final judgment. Then, he was attacked by a fellow inmate. On November 28, 1994, while attending to his work duties with 2 other convicted murderers, he was bludgeoned over the head with a metal bar from the prison weight room. His murderer was Christopher Scarver. Dahmer was pronounced dead 1 hour after the attack. Scarver claimed that the guards allowed the attack to happen because they left him alone. Scarver became somewhat of a folk hero in the Milwaukee community. He had taken out one of the worst murderers that the city had ever seen. The police urged everyone to remember that it was still a murder. The apartment where a majority of Dahmer's atrocious acts happened was demolished in 1992. A memorial garden was planned for some time, but the plans never came to fruition. In 1996, a group of citizens, the Milwaukee Civic Pride, raised more than $400,000 to purchase the items from Dahmer's crimes. They bought and collected all of the blades, saws, handcuffs, the refrigerator, anything related to the crimes. They came together in an undisclosed landfill and destroyed all the objects. They wanted to distance themselves from the gruesomeness of Dahmer's legacy. Thanks for listening. Please support us by rating or subscribing on the platform you are listening to the Minds of Murderers podcast on. If you want to get in touch, then you can do so by emailing us at mindsofmurdererspodcasts@gmail.com or by commenting on the video over at youtube.com/Murderpedia. We'll be back in 2 weeks for episode 5, which focuses on a unique British case from the early 2000s. If you're wondering where our discussion episodes have gone, these will be returning in the future, perhaps as a Patreon exclusive. Unfortunately, we simply do not have the time to record an episode a week at this point. Perhaps further down the line we will. Again, thanks very much for watching. Until next time.